Hello, my name is Enrique Barriuso. Welcome to this overview of the new features of Civil 3D 2023. We'll start with corridor targets. We now have the ability to add new objects dynamically when we are targeting a whole layer. We will explore a new label that we have for rail, some improvements in pressure networks, new ways to override the levels in a certain range, and the ability to add a property set in plan and label that in the profile. Some improvements in the performance when we have section view and profile viewports. A new node in Subassembly Composer, the auxiliary curve. And we'll finish with Dynamo for Civil 3D with a new interface, some new nodes and some improved nodes, and different ways of working with ports, wires, and groups. For the first new feature, we will start by looking at some of the changes that have been introduced for corridor targets. I'm going to access the targets for those two regions of the corridor. We can see the new dialog that was introduced in Civil 3D 2022.1, where you can now access all the targets from the same dialog without the need of any additional dialogs. Some of the options were missing initially. For surface targets, we didn't have this option to set all the targets at once. I can pick the existing ground, for instance, and it will set it to all the subassemblies at once. Now we have the possibility of picking from a drop-down. Initially, it was a radio button, similar to how it works for the offset and elevation targets. So a minor change to the interface there. So if I click OK, it's going to apply the surface targets. An improvement in the functionality is that we now can target a layer as we used to. But if we then add new objects to that layer, it's going to target those objects as well. So let me create a new layer. I'm going to call it targets. Make it red, for instance. Make it the current layer. And I'm going to draw some polylines that I'm going to add as an offset target. Let me draw a couple on each side. I'm going to target that layer for this region. As a width target, we can see the 4 entities, the 4 polylines. 4 out of 4. I can go to detail. I can see those 4 polylines being targeted. I'm going to target the farthest offset, and I'm going to use targets on the same side as the subassembly. This option was initially missing from this dialog as well. I'm going to do it on both sides. And we can see the targets being applied. What's new is that if I now add a couple of polylines after we apply the targets, if I access the dialog again with the targets, for this region. We can see that now it's picking those two new objects as well. Okay, so it will dynamically add any new objects on that layer. So if I rebuild the corridor, it will apply the new targets. We are now going to examine a new label that has been introduced for Rail. I can find the new label under the alignment labels. And it's this canned information label. Let me add that standard style. Pick the alignment, pick the chainage. And we can see the label there. I'm going to edit the label and have a look at the properties that are exposed in that label. So we can see here in the dropdown some of the properties that can be added, like the applied canned, canned deficiency, lateral acceleration, design speed, and so on. Let me add some of those properties here to the label, like the design speed. Let's add it there. Let's add the canned. And canned deficiency. Click OK. And we can see the kind of information that we now have the possibility of adding to the label. We will now explore some of the changes in pressure networks. I'm going to start by creating a profile for the pipe run. Add cut lengths following that surface profile. Let me change the styles of the two profiles. Okay, create a profile view. And when we select the pressure network, now we only get grips at the cut lengths. We used to have them at every PVI of the profile that we're following, or if we're following a surface, it will follow the triangulation of the surface. So it was a bit more difficult to make edits. So if I now move the edits, I can turn ortho mode to move it vertically, or I can move it diagonally as well, and it will add additional cut length if needed. Let me show you where the PVIs are in this particular profile, so you can see that is not following that. I'm going to pick a marker for the PVIs. points of vertical intersection, and you can see where the PDIs are, and the grips are not following the PDIs, are following the cut lengths. Okay, so we have this method to override the levels using the grips. If I access the pipe ramp profile and I go to the overrides, we can see the override in that area. When I move the grips, I can remove the override and it will go back to how it was. A second method that we have is to follow a profile. So we can follow multiple profiles and we can pick the profile that we're following in a particular range. So I'm going to create a profile. Okay, let's add some straight lines. Something like that. And now I'm going to follow that profile. So I access the overrides again. I'm going to add an override. I'll pick the start and the end station. I'm going from the start to the end of the profile here, but you don't have to. You can pick just a certain portion of the profile to follow. I'll pick the profile that I created. I'm going to say 0 for the vertical offset. And we can see how it's following that profile. One last new feature that I want to show is that you have now the ability to add a property set in plan and label that in the profile. Okay, let me create a property set here. I'm going to call it custom. Let's apply to all object types and add a custom property. Which is going to be text. And I'm going to add that property in plan. So I'm going to, let's say I pick that pipe. I'm going to add the property set to that first pipe. And I'm going to type the property, custom property in plan. I can now label that property in the profile. Let me go to the profile, add a label for the pressure network. A part in the profile. We're going to create a custom style. Let's change the name. And we're going to apply the property set. Custom property. And if I add the label, we can see here the custom property that we have in plan. We can refer to that in the profile. In earlier versions, you could only label properties that were applied to the profile part. So you would need to apply the property here in the profile as well as in the plan. Now you only need to apply to the plan, and you can label with that same property in plan and in profile. There has been a performance enhancement in drawings that contain section view or profile viewports. In earlier versions, when you selected one of those viewports, it will redraw all the entities in those viewports. For instance, if you have a pipe network in a section view, it's going to redraw the whole pipe network every time you select the viewport rather than just the pipe that's showing in the viewport. At the moment, it's a bit more efficient. It will still show those entities in the viewport, but it will not redraw the whole entity. In particular, this applies to pipe networks, pressure pipe networks, surfaces, and alignments. So it's going to be significantly faster. In typical drawings, it will be around 50% faster to switch from model space to paper space, and publishing will be faster as well. Depending on the number of viewports that you have, the increase in performance could be even greater than that. The downside of this new way of working is that if you move the viewport or you change the zoom level in the viewport, you're going to need to use the regen all command to regenerate all the entities and update the entities in the viewport so that it displays correctly. This new change has been introduced in a new system variable, which is ACC viewport opt OPT AECC viewport opt. It's on by default. If you turn it off, it will behave as earlier versions and is going to redraw all the entities every time you access the viewport. So we can see that it's taking a bit longer. If you have more viewports, the difference will be even more apparent. A couple of changes to note in Subassembly Composer. It will now indicate any unsaved changes with an asterisk next to the name of the file. So if I add a point, for instance, I can see the asterisk. And if I save, it will remove the asterisk. And the other one that's new is the auxiliary curve. It works in the same way as the curve that we already had, but as an auxiliary element. Okay, so let me add that. I've added some points. Let me pick the coordinates for those points. Something like that. Let's have a look at this auxiliary curve node. We have two methods to create an arc and another method to create a parabola. We can start with arc general. You can pick the start, the center, and the end, and it will draw the arc. You can control the tessellation, the number of segments, to define that arc. So if I pick a lower number, it will appear faceted. And if you pick a larger number, it will show more smoothly The maximum is 100. Arc 3 points. You can pick the start, an intermediate point, and the end of the arc. And for the parabola, you pick the start and the end, and then the mid-ordinate distance. If I pick 1 unit, that's going to be the distance from the segment defined from the start to the end in a perpendicular direction. And we will finish the video looking at the changes in Dynamo for Civil 3D. We can see that the interface looks a bit different. We can notice a new category, units, here. This used to be under math. Now it's its own category, and we have some nodes that have changed and some additional nodes here as well. So let me have a look at some of those. For instance, this one, convert by units. The precision has been improved for this particular node. So if I pick something like area, for instance, and I change to square meters from acres, let's say 10. Now we have more decimal places in the result. A node that is new here, or a few nodes, are those stringify nodes. Those will convert a number with the decimal places and the units into a string, into a text. So let's use the decimal, for instance. Let's see how it looks. We plug in the value, the precision, the number of decimal places. Let's say I want 3. And we add the symbol. We can find the node here with the symbols. I'm gonna look for square meters and connect that. There's an additional port that's optional to remove trailing zeros if you have them. The default value is false, so I'm going to keep that. You can see essentially what we had here, the same number, but this time with 3 decimal places and with the unit at the end. Some changes as well in the nodes and the wires that connect them. If I right-click on a port, we have the option to break connections, and it will remove any wires connecting to that port. I can also hide the wires, and that's going to keep the wires connected, but it will not show them. You can then show them again. I can right-click on a wire, and I can find similar options. Break connection and hide wire will do the same thing. We have this select connected option that's going to select everything that's connected to that wire. So we can see it's those 2 nodes in this instance. If I hover on the wire, I have 2 options. I can add a pin. I can add multiple pins if I want to. And the pin will be a useful way to make your wire go through certain points. So if you're going to go around a certain node, for instance. The other option that we have here is to add a watch node in between the wire. Okay, so if I move that around a little bit, you can see the watch node there. Okay, I'm going to create a group. I'm going to group those nodes. Let's say that I'm going to group those, for instance, in the usual way. Create the group. I'm going to remove that from the group, so that's no longer part of the group. Now I have the option to add a node to the group simply by clicking and dragging the node into the group. So if I click and drag this, now I can move the group and that node is part of the group. Another option that we have with groups is that we can collapse them. We have this option here, and it's going to collapse the group. So it can be handy if you want to save some space in your graph. You can collapse the groups and it will only keep the nodes that go in and out of that group. Okay, that was the last feature, the last new feature that I wanted to show. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.